I'm here in the garden at St. Stephen's Catholic Church in Portland, Oregon. April 23rd is the feast of St. George, Martyr. And, well, it's interesting. If you look up about St. George, you might find some sources that say, well, we really know nothing about St. George other than that he was martyred. Well, I'd like to counter that. And although some people will discount the historicity of this, calling it mere fables and legends, I'm going to turn to the golden legend of Jacobus Voragine. And there's quite an extensive chapter on St. George, which I think is wonderful. So let's take a look at the tradition that's been passed down through the golden legend of Jacobus Voragine. St. George. The name George, well, first of all, I want to show you a manuscript here. Manuscript from the Middle Ages. This is a manuscript for the Feast of St. George, and this has the introit of the Mass that would be sung for St. George. You see the musical notation up here, and the introit with the Gloria Patri and the Psalm verse, etc. On the flip side, we have continuation of the beautiful text here. So these manuscripts were applied to vellum, which is a calf skin. This serves as the paper, and they were painted with rare pigments. The blue was an especially rare pigment, and overlaid with gold leaf and elaborate illustrations. These would have most likely been used by the aristocracy and the royalty who attended Mass, who could afford to have very beautifully ornamented books called Books of Hours. All right, well, let's continue with the story of St. George here. Now, Jacobus Voragine begins, often many of these chapters begin telling a little bit about the name of the saint. The name George is derived from geos, meaning earth, and orge, meaning to work. Hence, one who works the earth, namely his own flesh. Now, Augustine writes in his book On the Holy Trinity that good earth is found high on the mountains, and in the temperate climate of the hills, and in level ground. The first, that from the mountains, bears good grass. The second, from the temperate climate of the hills, bears grapes, and the third, the level ground, bears the fruit of the fields. Thus blessed George was on the heights, because he disdained base things, and so had the fresh green of purity. He was temperate by his prudence, and so shared the wine of heavenly joy. He was lowly in his humility, and therefore bore the fruits of good works. Or George is derived from Gerar, holy, and Geon, sand, therefore holy sand. For he was like sand, heavy with the weight of his virtues, small by humility, and dry of the lusts of the flesh. Or again, the name comes from Gerar, holy, and Geon, struggle, so a holy fighter, because he fought against the dragon and the executioner. Or George comes from Gero, pilgrim, Gir, cut off, and Is, counselor, for he was a pilgrim in his contempt for the world, cut off by gaining the crown of martyrdom, and a counselor in his preaching of the kingdom. At the Council of Nicaea, his legend was included among the apocryphal writings, because there is no sure record of his martyrdom. In Bede's calendar, we read that he was martyred in the Persian city of Diaspolus, which formerly was called Lydda and is near Joppe. Elsewhere we read that he suffered under the emperors Diocletian and Maximian, or under the Persian emperor Dacian in the presence of 70 kings of his empire. Or we are told that he was put to death by the prefect Dacian during the reign of Diocletian and Maximian. Well, perhaps this is why some modern sources will just say that we don't know much about him. But rather than discount what comes ahead here, let's take a look at what Jacobus Voragine has to tell us. George, a native of Cappadocia, held the military rank of tribune. It happened that he once traveled to the city of Salina in the province of Libya. And near this town there was a pond as large as a lake, where a plague-bearing dragon lurked. and many times the dragon had put the populace to flight when they came out armed against him. For he used to come up to the city walls and poison everyone who came within reach of his breath. To appease the fury of this monster, the town people fed him 2 sheep every day. Otherwise he would invade their city, and a great many would perish. But in time they were running out of sheep, and could not get any more. So having held a council, they paid him tribute of 1 sheep and 1 man or woman. The name of a youth or maiden was drawn by lot, and no one was exempt from the draft. But soon almost all the young people had been eaten up. Then one day the lot fell upon the only daughter of the king, and she was seized and set aside for the dragon. The king, beside himself with grief, said, "Take my gold and my silver and the half of my kingdom, but release my daughter and spare her such a death." But the people were furious and shouted, "You yourself issued this decree, O king, and now that all our children are dead, you want to save your own daughter. Carry out for your daughter what you ordained for the rest, or we will burn you alive with your whole household." Well, hearing this, the king began to weep and said to his daughter, "My dearest child, what have I done to you? Or what shall I say? Am I never to see your wedding?" And turning to the people, he said, "I pray you leave my daughter for 1 week, so that we may weep together." This was granted, but at the end of a week, they came back in a rage, crying, "Why are you letting your people perish to save your daughter? Don't you see that we are all dying from the breath of this dragon?" So the king, seeing that he could not set his daughter free, arrayed her in regal garments, embraced her tearfully, and said, "Woe is me, my darling child! I thought I would see sons nursing at your royal breast, and now you must be devoured by the dragon. Alas, my sweetest child, I hoped to invite princes to your wedding, to adorn the palace with pearls, to hear the music of timbrel and harp, and now you must go and be swallowed up by the beast." He kissed her and sent her off, saying, "O my daughter, would that I had died before you, rather than lose you this way." Then she threw herself at his feet and begged his blessing, and when weeping he had blessed her, she started toward the lake. At this moment, Blessed George happened to be passing by, and seeing the maiden in tears, asked her why she wept. She answered, "Good youth, mount your horse quickly and flee, or you will die, as I am about to die." George responded, "Lady, fear not, but tell me, what are all these people waiting to see?" The damsel, "I see, good youth, that you have a great heart, but do you want to die with me? Get away speedily." George, "I will not leave here until you tell me the reason for this." And when she had told him all, he said, "Don't be afraid, child. I am going to help you in the name of Christ." She spoke, "Brave knight, make haste to save yourself. If not, you will die with me. It is enough that I die alone, for you cannot set me free, and you would perish with me." While they were talking, the dragon reared his head out of the lake, and trembling the maiden cried, "Away, sweet lord, away with all speed." But George, mounting his horse, and arming himself with the sign of the cross, he bravely set upon the approaching dragon, and commending himself to God, brandished his lance, dealt the beast a grievous wound, and forced him to the ground. Then he called to the maiden, "Have no fear, child. Throw your girdle around the dragon's neck. Don't hesitate." When she had done this, the dragon rose and followed her, like a little dog on a leash. She led him toward the city, but the people, seeing this, ran for the mountains and the hills, crying out, "Now we will be eaten alive." But Blessed George waved them back and said to them, "You have nothing to fear. The Lord has sent me to deliver you from the trouble this dragon has caused you. Believe in Christ and be baptized, every one of you, and I shall slay the dragon." Then the king and all the people were baptized, and George, drawing his sword, put an end to the beast and ordered him to be moved out of the city, whereupon 4 yoke of oxen hauled him away into a broad field outside the walls. On that day, 20,000 were baptized, not counting the women and children. The king built a magnificent church there in honor of Blessed Mary and St. George, and from the altar flowed a spring whose waters cure all diseases. He also offered a huge sum of money to Blessed George, who refused to accept it and ordered it to be distributed to the poor. Then he gave the king 4 brief instructions. 1. To have good care for the church of God, to honor the priests, to assist with devotion at the divine office, and to have the poor always in mind. Finally, he embraced the king and took his leave. Some books, however, tell us that at the very moment when the dragon was about to swallow the girl alive, George, making the sign of the cross, rode upon him and killed him. At this time, in the reign of Diocletian and Maximian, the prefect Dacian launched against the Christians a persecution so violent that in 1 month 17,000 won the crown of martyrdom, while many others, being threatened with torture, gave in and offered sacrifice to the idols. Well, seeing this, St. George, overcome with grief, gave away all his possessions, laid aside his military trappings, and put on the garb of the Christians. He then pushed into the middle of the crowd and cried out, "All your gods are demons, and our God alone is the creator of the heavens." Well, this angered the prefect, who retorted, "By what rashness do you call our gods demons? Where do you come from, and what is your name?" George answered him, "My name is George. I come of noble forebears in Cappadocia. With the help of Christ I have conquered Palestine, but now I have left all to serve the God of heaven more freely." Well, the prefect, seeing that he could not win him over, commanded that he be stretched on the rack, and had him torn limb from limb with hooks. His body was burned with flaming torches, and salt was rubbed into his gaping wounds. That very night the Lord appeared to him in the midst of a great light, and so sweetly comforted him with his presence and his words that the saint thought nothing of his torments. Well, Dacian, now convinced that the infliction of pain was of no avail, summoned a certain magician and said to him, "It must be by their magical arts that the Christians make light of our tortures, and they hold sacrifice to our gods to be worthless." The magician replied, "If I cannot overcome his spells, let my head be forfeit." And thereupon, relying on his magic and invoking the names of his gods, he mixed poison into some wine and gave it to Blessed George to drink. But the saint made the sign of the cross over the wine. He drank it with no ill effect. He drank it and suffered no harm. Then the magician put a stronger dose of poison into the wine, but the saint, again making the sign of the cross over the cup, drank it with no ill effect. At this, the magician prostrated himself at George's feet, begged his pardon with loud lamentation, and asked that he be made a Christian. For this, he was beheaded in due time. The following day, the prefect ordered George to be bound upon a wheel that was fitted with sharp knives, but the wheel fell apart at once, and the saint remained unharmed. Dacian then had him plunged into a cauldron of molten lead, but George made the sign of the cross, and by God's power settled down as though he were in a refreshing bath. Now, realizing that he was getting nowhere with threats and torments, Dacian thought that he might bring the saint around with soft speech. "George, my son," he said, "you see how long-suffering our gods are. They put up with your blasphemies so patiently, yet are ready to forgive you if you consent to be converted. Follow my advice then, dearest son. Give up your superstition, sacrifice to our gods, and win great honors from them and from ourselves." George smiled and replied, "Why did you not say kind things to me before, instead of trying to overcome me by torture? So be it. I am ready to do as you say." Dacian, deluded, was glad to hear this, and ordered the herald to call the whole populace together to see George, who had resisted so long, finally yield and worship the gods. The city was strung with garlands and filled with rejoicing, and all stood by as George came into the temple to offer sacrifice. He fell to his knees and prayed the Lord to destroy the temple with its idols so completely that for the glory of God and the conversion of the people, nothing would be left of it. Immediately, fire came down from heaven and consumed the temple, the idols, and the priests, and the earth opened and swallowed up anything that was left. Well, St. Ambrose says in his preface for St. George, while Christianity was professed only under cover of silence, George, most loyal soldier of Christ, alone and intrepid among Christians, openly professed his faith in the Son of God, and the grace of God in return gave him such fortitude that he could scorn the commands of tyrants and face the pain of innumerable torments. O blessed and noble fighter for the Lord! Not only was he not won over by the flattering promise of earthly power, but he fooled his persecutor and cast the images of his false gods into the abyss. Thus Ambrose. Well, when Dacian had heard what had happened, he had George brought before him and said, "How evil can you be, you wickedest of men, that you could commit so great a crime?" George retorted, "You do me wrong, O king. Come along with me, and watch me offer sacrifice again." "You trickster," Dacian exclaimed. "What you want to do is to get me swallowed up as you made the earth swallow the temple and my gods." "Miserable man," George answered, "how can your gods, who could not help themselves, help you?" Enraged, the king said to Alexandria, his wife, "I shall faint, I shall die, because I see that this man has got the best of me." Her response was, "Cruel, bloodthirsty tyrant, did I not tell you not to go on mistreating the Christians, because their God would fight for them? And now let me tell you that I want to become a Christian." Stupefied, the king cried, "Oh, worse and worse, so you too have been led astray." And thereupon he had her hung up by the hair of her head and beaten with scourges. And while she was being beaten, she said to George, "O George, light of truth, what do you think will become of me, since I have not been reborn in the waters of baptism?" "You have nothing to fear, lady," he answered. "The shedding of your blood will be both your baptism and your crown." And with that she prayed to the Lord and breathed her last. Ambrose testifies to this, saying in his preface, "For this reason the queen of the pagan Persians, though she had not yet been baptized, was shown mercy, and received the palm of martyrdom when her cruel spouse had condemned her to death. Hence we may not doubt that she, crimson with the dew of her blood, gained entrance through the celestial portal and merited the kingdom of heaven." And thus Ambrose. The following day, George was sentenced to be dragged through the whole city and then beheaded. He prayed the Lord that all who implored his help might have their requests granted, and a heavenly voice came to him saying that it would be so. His prayer finished, his head was cut off, and his martyrdom accomplished in the reign of the emperors Diocletian and Maximian, which began about the year of the Lord 287. As for Dacian, while he was on his way back to his palace from the place of execution, fire fell from above and consumed him and his attendants. Gregory of Tours relates that some men were carrying away relics of St. George and were given hospitality at a certain chapel overnight, and in the morning they were absolutely unable to move the casket containing the relics until they had shared them with the oratory. And in the history of Antioch, we read that during the Crusades, when the Christians were on their way to besiege Jerusalem, a very beautiful young man appeared to a certain priest. He told the priest that he was St. George, the captain of the Christian host, and that if the Crusaders carried his relics to Jerusalem, he would be with them. And then, when they had laid siege to the city, they did not dare mount the scaling ladders in the face of the Saracens' resistance. But St. George appeared to them, wearing white armor marked with the red cross, and made them understand that they could follow him up the walls in safety, and the city would be theirs. And thus reassured, the army took the city and slaughtered the Saracens. And there we have the account of Jacobus Voragine of St. George. All of this in Volume 1 of The Golden Legend, available from Princeton University Press, and readily available. It's a great story, very, very heroic. Let us all be inspired by his heroism and nobility and courage to always be faithful to the Lord in whatever trials might come our way. Let us also be mindful never to offer sacrifice to any false gods, to any idols, and neither to fear them. We must trust in the Lord, even to the shedding of our blood. Well, if you like this video, please share it with a friend. Please subscribe to this video channel, and don't miss a day of prayer with us. In nome Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.